Well, folks, here we are. This is the last section of the class, and it's on elections. The textbook chapter is called Voting, Campaigns, and Elections, and I have the opening page of that chapter up on the screen now. And as you can see, it addresses a lot of important topics pertaining to mass political behavior in the United States, the role of party identification in predicting how people will vote. It's huge. Why negative advertising works. Do elections actually work to hold leaders accountable? What is the logic of elections in democracy? How do different segments of our society vote? And how they obtain the right to vote? The factors that affect how people vote? The basic elements of campaigns, all of which is very important. And so this is, again, another example of how I can only cover so much in the context of these lecture videos, short of reading the entire chapter to you, which you don't want, nor do I. What I'm going to focus on is this first question, though. If Americans cherish the right to vote, why do so many neglect to exercise it? So I'm going to focus on voter turnout and the things that are affecting it, the sources of voter turnout, the factors that encourage it, what suppresses it, and I'm going to focus for the second half of this conversation on the movement that has dominated this topic in the last since we had the first black man elected president in the United States, and that is the voter ID movement and election conspiracy theories about rigged elections and voter fraud, and what those are really all about. And so here we go. This is voter turnout in the United States from 1860 to 2020, and as you can see, it's had its peaks and valleys. Voter turnout used to be extraordinarily high in the United States, but that's kind of misleading. Before the 1900s, the political parties controlled the election process, and the parties printed their own ballots, and the parties also had people out during the voting process as elections were being conducted to make sure that partisans did vote and voted the way they wanted to do, and they actually often bought votes. There was a lot of corruption and vote buying going on. This was possible because the voting process was conducted in public. There were no private voting booths that you could go into and vote without someone watching and seeing how you voted. Part of the progressive reforms in the late 1800s and early 1900s that brought about a number of things, such as primary elections and the direct election of senators, included in that was the institution of privacy in the voting process. Once people were able to vote in private, though, and the political parties couldn't see that they were getting the return on their money for the votes they were buying, that you could pay a voter, but if you didn't see how they voted, you weren't sure the person was voting the way you were paying them to vote. Vote buying stopped, the corruption wasn't really worth it anymore, and turnout dropped quite a bit. Since then, voter turnout has ebbed and flowed. In the 2020 election, we hit a peak of about a 120-year high, with turnout in the 63% range, no doubt owing to the highly contested, highly polarized contest between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. It was probably, to be honest, a lot more about Trump, either those who support him and those who oppose him. And in both cases, it's pretty vehement than it was about Biden. But, so you might look at that and say, okay, we're doing pretty well. Well, actually, we're not. For the most part, this is what American polling places tend to look like during most of the day on election day, pretty empty. As opposed to, say, this. This is a picture from the first democratic election in Afghanistan, where people walked for miles and queued for miles for the right to vote. And this was despite the fact that the Taliban in Afghanistan, a group that opposed democracy and certainly then opposed elections, actually issued threats of violence against voters and carried out some of those threats. In this election, people would vote by dipping their finger in some ink and using that ink to mark the ballot, and the ink on the finger was basically an indicator that they had voted. Some people had those fingers cut off by the Taliban as a pretty violent warning sign against voting. Despite that, people line up like this in order to vote. Again, though, in the United States, we tend to look more like this than like that, unless you not believe a couple of pictures. Here's some actual data on that point. This is U.S. voter turnout rates compared to other democratic nations. Here's the United States in the bolded line down here in the bottom third of this list of countries. And our turnout in our highest election here is shown to be at about 62.3%. And that is in the 2020 election, by the way. mind you. Our high point for the last 120 years, going back to the first slide, that data point is based on this level. But this level is hardly representative of what turnout in the United States has been like for most of of recent history. We have had periods not that long ago in the 1992 election where we fell below 50% in some cases. So this depiction of U.S. voter turnout actually inflates the level of normal voter turnout. And even at that inflated level, look how far down the list we are of democratic countries. Voter turnout is not particularly high in the United States, despite the fact that we like to regard ourselves as this beacon of democracy to the rest of the world. So let's talk about the factors that underlie turning out to vote. So I've depicted this as a turnout formula, and it is comprised of attitudes, actions, socio-demographic factors, and then institutional factors. And the text does quite the same in terms of individual versus institutional factors that either encourage or discourage voter turnout. In terms of attitudes, here's the things that we know that correlate with voter turnout. Having a strong party affiliation. The stronger your party identification, the more likely you are to vote. And of course, the more likely you are to vote along those party lines. People who have a strong sense of political efficacy are also more likely to vote. Efficacy means you have a sense that government responds to you, that the political system is responsive to citizens, that you can affect the system. If you believe that, you're more likely to vote. People who have higher levels of trust in government and greater interest in the election, not surprisingly, are more likely to vote. People who undertake certain behaviors and actions, those behaviors and actions also likewise correlate with voter turnout. Those who are involved in politics, who talk about politics, trying to persuade others, they're voters. The people who take the time to watch the conventions and the candidate debates, who work for a party or a candidate, they're going to vote. And of course, people who bother to impart their financial resources to a campaign and by donations, of course they're going to vote. Other factors that we know are correlated with voting, socio-demographics are highly correlated with voting. The higher you are on all of these things, education level, occupational prestige, income level, and age, the more likely you are to vote. And of course, being more educated or having more money, having a more prestigious occupation, being older, those things don't in and of themselves cause you to vote, but they put you in a context and circumstances that makes voting more likely. People who are more educated have a better understanding of how the system works. People have a higher occupation level and greater income, probably feel more invested in the system, probably feel more at stake in terms of their wealth and the taxes they pay and what the system does. Age is kind of interesting. Being older doesn't make you vote, but it probably puts you in some of those other socio-demographic categories. Also, being younger people tend to be more mobile, tend to move around a lot more, residentially mobile. And of course, that feeds into the next thing we're going to talk about, the institutional factors. Every time you move, you have to re-register, so there's another step in the process that younger people face more than older. And also, I think, the older you are, the more you see yourself connected to the system, the more you're invested in the system. You've perhaps bought a home, you're paying more in taxes. You just feel more at stake personally than perhaps when you're younger. And then there's the institutional context in which elections take place. Are elections competitive? Are there strong linkages between the political parties and the electorate, between other social groups like labor unions? Okay. And then the third part of the turnout formula has to do with the procedural aspect of the institutional requirements, the institutional context. What are the rules for eligibility and the process of voting itself? Those rules are not neutral. They can either encourage participation or they can make it harder. So what are the voter eligibility laws? What are the registration procedures and rules? How easy is it to register? Is the onus of registering, the burden of registering to vote, is that on the citizen to seek it out, or is it on the government to seek out the citizens? How far ahead of the election are deadlines to register? How readily available are registration sites? How long are those sites open? If voter registration rolls are purged periodically, what are the rules for doing so? How easy is it to re-register if you've been purged? Does your country vote on a Tuesday for some strange reason? Does your country require some kind of proof of identity in order to be allowed to vote? Getting at a couple things we'll talk about later. There's been a ton of research, decades of research in political science on all these things. And to sum up this large body of research in just a few words, if it came down to just the first things that I mentioned in that formula, attitudes, actions, and demographics, those things would predispose the United States to have higher voter turnout than any other country in the world. We are more likely to have the kinds of attitudes, engage in the kinds of actions, and fall in the socio-demographic categories that would predispose us to higher turnout than most democracies. Our turnout would be advantaged by about 5 percentage points by those attitudinal factors. It's the institutional barriers that more than offset that attitudinal advantage. There's about a 27 percentage point disadvantage imposed on voter turnout by the combination of institutional procedural requirements we have. Registration laws alone in the United States account for about a 14 percentage point decline in voter turnout in the U.S. compared to other countries that have less burdensome registration requirements. So that being the case, and that being well understood, this is not a mystery among political scientists, and for that matter among policymakers. You would think that a country that valued democracy and thus would value greater rather than lesser voter participation would do things to change that institutional context, to make it more likely to vote, make it easier to vote, to ease the burden of registration and the institutional procedures. And indeed, some things have happened over the last 10, 20 years along those lines. In 1993, the motor voter law was passed, which is why if you go to the DMV or the post office or any number of government offices, you will find voter registration forms. They didn't used to be there. You used to have to go to an actual registration office, and sometimes there would only be one in an entire county, and you'd have to go there to get those forms. The point of this law was to make those forms more readily available, more widespread. A number of states have also expanded and begin to offer, and some states offer exclusively, voting by mail and absentee voting. So rather than insist that people go to a polling site on election day and there's no other place no other way you can vote, no other place you can vote, no other day you can vote, some states have said, let's expand this, let's make it easier, let's give people a break. Great. However, there are a number of other ongoing changes that are more current than those that are working against voter turnout. Changes to the process, to the institutional setting, to the requirements that are making it more onerous, more burdensome to vote, which is odd in a democracy. You'd think we would go the other way. You'd think we would be doing everything we could to encourage voting. We'll talk for the whole second half of this conversation about voter ID laws, so I'm going to let that go for a second. But it's not just voter ID laws. Many states have moved to end same-day registration, have worked to curtail early voting periods, are closing polling places, and closing DMVs at which registration can often happen, often in minority areas. States are more aggressively purging election rolls. States are more aggressively gerrymandering congressional districts into non-competitive races. And as we've already said, the level of competitiveness of the election has a lot to do with the level of interest in it, and therefore voter turnout. So there's a push-pull in this country with some forces operating in ways that will expand turnout, but others and more than the latter working to suppress turnout. And we'll get into exactly why that is later on in this conversation. If we wanted to make voting easier, there's some things that we could do that would be pretty effective and wouldn't be that hard. We have holidays for so many things in this country. Why don't we make the defining act that establishes us as a democracy, Election Day, why don't we make that a holiday? Why don't we move Election Day to the weekend and have a Friday through Monday holiday or something like that, surrounding and celebrating elections? Why do we have elections on Tuesday in the first place? It makes no sense. It's not in the Constitution. It came about as part of the logic of an agrarian economy where farmers would work all week. Saturday was the day for the crops. Sunday was the Sabbath day. That left Monday to travel to a polling place and Election Day to be the day, Tuesday to be the day to vote, and then you go back. That logic, that lifestyle certainly no longer applies to the vast majority of the country, and yet we still maintained a Tuesday, a work day in the middle of the week as Election Day. That's not convenient for a lot of people. Yes, it's businesses are required by law, employers are required by law to give people the day off if they want to go vote, or give people time off to go vote. But that's good, but making it a holiday and closing most businesses, as we do for many other important days that we celebrate over the calendar year in this country, why wouldn't we do that for Election Day? Even more effective and admittedly more controversial would be to make voting mandatory. You might be freaking out at the sound of making something mandatory, something like voting. I would argue for the following reasons. Well, for a lot of reasons. One, if everybody voted, that would change the nature of the electorate and would make our politics much less extreme. The way it is now, extreme partisans are more likely to turn out to vote than people who are more moderate. That means that the composition of the electorate, the thing to which elected officials are responsible for their elections, is more extreme. If we increased turnout among moderates, that would temper that. And if we made election participation voting mandatory, that would bring more moderates into the electorate. But what about individual freedoms? What about liberty? We can't make things mandatory in the United States. I would argue that there are two things that citizens in a democracy have to do. One is you got to pay your taxes to pay for those things that you want that government to do for you. If you want roads and highways and an economic system and schools and defense and public safety and all that stuff, then you got to pay for it, and that's what taxes do. And the other is you have to vote. You should have to participate in the system that chooses your leaders. Paying taxes is not mandatory, is not optional, it's mandatory. So why not voting? A lot of countries, not a lot, several countries have mandatory voting. They have the option, every one of them, if you don't like the candidates that you see on the ballot before you, you can choose none of the above. You're not compelled to vote for a candidate or a party you don't like, but you do have to vote. If you don't, there's a fine. The fine it depends on the system. Sometimes it's cumulative. It's not a back-breaking fine. It's enough to get you to probably do it. There are ways to get excused, for medical reasons or health reasons or whatever. So it's not completely onerous. But I don't think mandatory voting is a radical idea. It'll never happen in the United States. That's another story. Maybe I'm looking at this the wrong way. I want to go back to our long-running conversation through this class about collective action. Maybe as I'm wondering why so few people vote, maybe the real question is, why does anybody vote? Is voting a rational act? We talked in the last section on public opinion about rational ignorance. Maybe rational non-participation makes a whole lot more sense. As with becoming informed about politics, paying the cost to do so, when you as an individual, your level of information doesn't elevate the overall level of democracy in the country. It takes millions of people becoming informed to do that. The same exact logic applies to voting participation. Elections create a collective action problem. Election outcomes are a collective good. They require collective action to bring them about, and they are not excludable. In the 2020 election, over 81 million people voted for Joseph Biden, and over 74 million people voted for Donald Trump. That is, quick count, 155 million people bringing about this election outcome, and the election outcome is non-excludable. So you put those two things together, your odds of influencing that Biden versus Trump election, your one vote in a sea of 155 million votes, you're not going to affect anything. And since the result is non-excludable, the Biden presidency is a non-excludable outcome. You enjoy it, you suffer from it, whatever your perspective is, but your vote wouldn't have changed it. Why not free ride? Why not let everybody else vote? And you just take the outcome, whatever it is, happy or sad. You couldn't have affected it, you couldn't have switched it by voting yourself, so why not just free ride? Every year, NPR, and I'm not usually a big fan of these things, these sort of trying to get a sense of the pulse of the electorate by interviewing a handful of people. That's absurd on the face of it. But I think that some of these discussions can kind of get at the underlying reason that people fall back on why they don't vote. And so every year, NPR goes out among the public and asks people questions. And in one particular year, they asked people why they don't vote. So they went to a bunch of non-voters to try and understand why they don't vote. And here are a few of the responses that people gave. This person, Lindsay Jackson from Jonesboro, Arkansas, said, "I'm not a registered voter. I have never voted and do not plan to this election year. I don't vote because I believe at the end of the day, money is more powerful than a ballot." So I call her the cynic. She understands the influence of money in our system and thinks that voting is kind of a charade. Okay, I kind of get that. This guy, Luke Banda, I call the statistical realist. He says, "A simple understanding of statistics shows that my vote does not matter," which I think he's referring to this right here. And in a strict sense, he's right. Now, we talked before, when we talked about interest groups and why public interest groups can manage to survive given the temptation of free ride and enjoy the benefits if they're achieved that those public interest groups are striving to create. If everyone thought like Luke Banda and simply said, statistically, my vote's not going to change anything, so why bother? There would be zero voter turnout. So there must be something else going on. There must be, as we talked about before, moral incentives, people just feeling that it's their duty to vote regardless of the impact their one vote's going to have on the system. And maybe there are selective incentives. Maybe you are part of a community of voters and you get that "I voted" sticker, which you only get it if you vote. You don't get it if you don't vote. So that's maybe kind of similar to the Sierra Club tote bag. Okay. But, Luke Banda says, hell with all that. A simple understanding of statistics shows my vote doesn't matter. I call this person the conscientious religious objector. This is Janice Hudson of Montgomery, Alabama. "I don't vote because as a Christian and a student of the Bible, I feel it is not a Christian's place to become involved in politics. If one were to research the early Christian church's opinions on politics, you would see that they, like Jesus, were neutral in all political matters since they considered God's kingdom as the only solution to mankind's problems." Okay, so she, for faith-based reasons, she prefers to leave politics aside, and that's just not part of her world. All right. And then there's this guy, Mark Guadagni. I probably butchered his last name. We'll call him Mark. I call him the pragmatic, selfish person. "I don't register to vote because I don't want to increase my chances of getting jury duty." First off, that's not how you get jury duty. That's from the DMV rules. So registered to vote has no effect. "I live in California, which typically isn't a swing state. I don't feel I have any strong convictions to vote for something that's rarely decided by one vote." Okay, so there's some statistical realists going on there. Yes, California's not a swing state in the presidential election. That doesn't mean there aren't all kinds of competitive in-state and other federal races that votes matter, but all right. This is my favorite part, though. "I choose to be politically active in other manners, such as precinct walking for candidates, writing letters to local congressmen, and participating in online discussions like this one." I'm sorry, but if you're walking the precinct for a candidate, you're voting for that candidate. I don't believe this guy for a second. But whatever. People have their reasons for not voting. I'm going to give a different reason for not voting, and that is we make it harder. Political science needs more laws. We've talked about Duverger's law, a single-member district plurality election rule. That is why we have a two-party system. Okay, so there's one. We need a second law. I think the more laws we have, the more of a science we'll feel like. So I'm offering now a new law, and I get to name it after myself since I came up with a law. That's how it works. If you make something hard to do, people will do it less, and vice versa. We've made voting harder in this country. It's ebbed and flowed. Sometimes we've made it easier, but especially in the last 20 or 30 years, we've taken steps to make it harder. We have a long history of making voting harder, particularly among targeted populations in our society. And when you do that, when you make it harder to do something, people will do it less. It's a law. Let's have a little history lesson involving the post-Civil War Reconstruction period. In the aftermath of the Civil War, federal troops were sent to the South to basically enforce the terms of the surrender of the South to the North in the Civil War. And this led to a huge increase in voter turnout among African Americans in the South. The federal government was basically there to protect black voting rights, and it barred former Confederate soldiers from voting. This was a huge boost for Republicans. The Republican Party at that time was the party of Abraham Lincoln, and the Democratic Party was the party of the Civil War South. And so this helped Republicans, it hurt Democrats. This led to a big increase in the number of African Americans holding office in the South. Okay, so that's 1865 to about 1876. Then in 1876, we had a presidential election. It was between Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate, and the Democrat Samuel Tilden. This was a disputed election. There was no clear electoral college winner owing to ballot controversies and ballot irregularities in a number of states, including Florida. This was very much like the 2000 disputed election between Bush and Gore, which centered on the state of Florida and ballot irregularities in Florida. There was no winner in this election for months as the parties negotiated a compromise. And the compromise they eventually settled on was the Republicans got the presidency. Rutherford B. Hayes became president. But the Democrats, in exchange, got the end of Reconstruction, the withdrawal of northern troops from the South. And so federal enforcement of the terms of the surrender and the terms of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Amendments in the South were removed. And what this led to immediately was efforts to suppress the vote. It was at this time that we saw the imposition of poll taxes in many southern states. This is an example of an actual poll tax receipt in Louisiana. So this was a tax that was imposed upon voters, and often it was as much as 2 weeks' salary. It was often cumulative as well, retroactive. So a voter who hadn't voted in a number of elections owed the poll tax for all the elections that person had not yet voted in. We also at this time saw the imposition of literacy tests. And again, not to pick on Louisiana, here are some examples of literacy test questions that were imposed on voters. And some of these, you can handle. Some are just so strange that understanding what the question is even asking, never mind answering it, is pretty convoluted. It continues on. Here's some more. This number 23, draw a figure that is square in shape. Divide it in half by drawing a straight line from its northeast corner to its southwest corner, and then divide it once more by drawing a broken line from the middle of its west. What is that about? What's the point of that? How does answering this question say anything about one's preparation or ability to vote? I mean, it doesn't, obviously. These literacy tests involved questions requiring you to fill in blanks. There were questions of reading fluency and constitutional interpretation. There were this ridiculously tricky word puzzles. And, of course, these tests were administered to black voters primarily and graded by white registrars, white voter registrars. And, of course, the grading was hardly neutral. A white voter in one of these tests wrote this, which I guess is supposed to mean freedom of speech, and that was considered passing. A black voter wrote, peaceful assembly means one may assemble or belong to any group, club, or organization he chooses as long as it's within the law, and that was considered a failing result. As a result of this kind of voter suppression tactic, which again happened after Reconstruction ended and there was no more federal enforcement of voting rights in the South, this is what took place. Still picking on the state of Louisiana, I guess. The number of registered black voters in Louisiana in 1888 was over 127,000, almost 128,000. By 1910, that had declined to 730. The total number of African Americans serving in the House of Representatives by the 1880s was 22. Just 20 years later, it was down to 1, and that 1 was George White from North Carolina, who retired in 1901, and not another African American member of Congress was elected from the South until 1972. This voter suppression, these Jim Crow laws, post-Reconstruction, had the intended effect of suppressing black political participation in terms of voting, in terms of office holding. That's what they were designed to do. They did it. We've already talked about the civil rights movement in the section of the class on civil rights, but of course all of this led to the protest marches in Selma and Montgomery, Alabama. The civil rights movement led to ultimately the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 had several key provisions, paramount among which were suspending literacy tests and poll taxes, giving the federal government the power to monitor elections in the South and to register black voters in the South, and maybe most importantly of all, Section 5, known as pre-clearance. Section 5 was a section of the Voting Rights Act that required any change in the areas in the country that had a history of discriminatory voting practices based on racial discrimination. So in other words, virtually the entire South and a few other areas. Before any change to the voting process was made by election officials in those areas, that change had to be run by federal authorities ahead of time. They had to get pre-clearance, prior approval to change anything, to close a polling place, to change the hours of the polling place, to make any change to the ballot procedures. Any change at all in the voting process had to be cleared ahead of time before it could be implemented. And it had to be cleared by either a federal court or a federal government agency. And that federal entity had an eye toward examining this proposed change to see whether or not there seemed to be some sort of discriminatory intent behind the change. The pre-clearance provision of the Voting Rights Act was probably the most effective part of the act, and it led to a stark increase in black voter turnout, black voter participation, African Americans holding federal office throughout the South in the area affected. It worked. Prior to pre-clearance, if a black voter had issue with a discriminatory election practice, that voter had to take the jurisdiction in question, the county, the state, whatever, had to take them to court after the fact and seek redress after it already happened. A, that was expensive. B, it took years to litigate these things. Most people couldn't afford it. And C, even if a verdict were rendered in that person's favor, the election was over. They weren't undoing election results. It was a very unsatisfactory way to address the problem. Pre-clearance nipped these things in the bud, and it worked. Well, it worked until 2013. The Shelby versus Holder decision by the Supreme Court in 2013, in my mind, is going to go down with Plessy versus Ferguson and Citizens United and a handful of others that I could name as probably the worst Supreme Court decisions that the court has ever handed down. Various jurisdictions in 2013 sued the then Attorney General, Eric Holder, and Shelby County, Alabama was the sort of the place where the suit was brought, so it was Shelby versus Holder, arguing that pre-clearance was no longer necessary. That in fact, that aspect of the Voting Rights Act was discriminatory. That yes, these areas had discriminated long in the past, but those were back in the days of racism and Jim Crow. That the South has come a long way and attitudes have changed, and so we no longer need to have pre-clearance. In fact, it's unfair to impose these pre-clearance requirements on some areas but not others. It's discriminatory. Well, the Supreme Court bought that. The Supreme Court invalidated the pre-clearance section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So as of today, 10 years later, there is no longer any pre-clearance needed for changes in voting procedures in these areas. Well, the ink was barely dry on the Shelby versus Holder decision, and I mean that almost literally, before states swung into action imposing, once again, discriminatory voting practices. This is from the Brennan Center for Justice. This is the article that you're seeing on the screen now. Within 24 hours of the ruling, Texas announced it would implement a strict voter ID law. Two other states, Mississippi and Alabama, also began to enforce voter ID laws that had previously been barred because of pre-clearance. The Brennan Center for Justice has consistently found that states previously covered by pre-clearance have engaged in recent significant efforts to disenfranchise voters. And here we go, the discussion about voter ID. There's probably been no more, to my mind, disturbing development in terms of changes to the voting laws of this country than the movement since the early 2000s, mid 2008, 2010, to impose voter ID requirements under the purported guise of rampant voter fraud and conspiracy theories about rigged elections. So I'm going to take a break here, and we're going to get into voter ID, the arguments for it, and I'm going to make arguments against it. Will I persuade you? It's not really my job, but I think it is my job to point out the severe logical flaws in the arguments on behalf of voter ID. So I'll take a break here, and we'll come back, we'll continue this conversation.